The Galactic Council had been meeting for over 40,000 years. In all that time, they had never been afraid of a new species. Today, that was about to change. High Counselor Veshinarl stood in the great crystal amphitheater of Harmony Station. She was a Quilsari, a being made of living crystal that caught the light and spread it in rainbow patterns across the walls. Around her sat delegates from 312 different species. Some breathed oxygen, some breathed methane, some did not breathe at all. But they all came together in peace. Peace was everything to the Council. Wars were ancient history, stories told to children about the bad old days. For 15,000 years, no species had raised a weapon against another. Conflicts were solved with words, with trade agreements, with careful diplomacy. Violence was simply not done anymore. Today, they would welcome the newest species to their peaceful family. The humans, Veshinarl, had read the reports about humanity. They were young, barely reaching for the stars. They had only discovered faster-than-light travel 3 cycles ago. The Council had detected their presence through their nuclear tests, bright flashes of atomic energy that lit up the sensors from 80 light-years away. The reports showed a species that fought among themselves often, very often. Wars seemed to be a constant in their history, but that was normal for young species. Most races went through a violent phase before they grew up and joined civilized society. The Karathi had been warriors once. Now they were poets and philosophers. The same would happen with humans given time. Veshinarl hummed softly, a sound like wind chimes. She felt optimistic. The humans had sent word that they were coming. They had followed all the proper protocols. They had accepted the invitation gracefully. All good signs. The 3 security officers stood near the entrance. They wore no armor and carried no weapons. There had been no need for such things in living memory. Their job was to greet visitors and help them find their seats. It was a ceremonial position, really. A holdover from ancient times. The station's sensors pinged. A ship was approaching. The human ship, Veshinarl felt a flutter of excitement. First contact was always special. She adjusted her translation device and waited. The sensor officer, a young Threxian, suddenly made a concerned buzzing sound. Several of his drone bodies clustered around his console. Something was wrong. The human ship was approaching fast. Too fast. The proximity alarm started ringing. Ships were supposed to slow down well before reaching the station. It was basic courtesy. But the human vessel was still accelerating. At the last moment, it decelerated. Hard. The kind of maneuver that would crush most species against their walls. But it stopped perfectly at the docking port. The sensor officer's buzzing grew more agitated. The human ship was scanning them. Active sensors swept across the station again and again. To the Threxian's equipment, it looked exactly like a weapons lock. Veshinarl tried to stay calm. Perhaps humans simply had different scanning protocols. Yes, that must be it. Then she saw the ship itself on the visual display. It was not beautiful. Council ships were works of art, designed to inspire wonder and show the grace of their builders. The human ship was purely functional. It had a thick, armored hull covered in scorch marks. Strange protrusions jutted from its surface. The computer identified them as sensor arrays. But they looked disturbingly like weapon ports. The name was written on the side in bold letters, UNSS Indomitable, Indomitable. Veshinarl knew that word from the human languages. It meant unstoppable, unbreakable. Why would anyone name a diplomatic vessel something like that? The communication request came through. Veshinarl accepted it with a gesture. A human voice spoke. It was brief and direct. Too direct. Council species usually spent several minutes on proper greetings, establishing goodwill and mutual respect. The human simply said they were ready to dock and requested permission. The tone was not rude, but it was military. Efficient, clipped. Veshinarl granted permission. What else could she do? The docking process was quick. Too quick. Most species took time, moving slowly to show they were peaceful. The human ship locked on and sealed the connection in moments. The amphitheater fell silent. 312 species watched the entrance. The airlock door opened with a hiss of escaping air that made several delegates jump. The first human emerged. She was tall, with dark skin and eyes that moved constantly, scanning the room. She wore a uniform covered in colorful ribbons and metal decorations. Veshinarl's computer identified them as military service awards. Each ribbon represented a campaign, a battle, a war. There were many ribbons. The woman stepped to the side and stood at attention. 5 more humans followed, all wearing similar uniforms. They moved together with practiced precision. They did not look around with wonder like most new species. Their eyes swept the room in careful patterns, noting exits, counting occupants, assessing threats. Because that was what they were doing. Threat assessment. Every security protocol in their training was active. They could not help it, but the council did not know that. To them, it looked like a military squad preparing for combat. Then came the civilians. The lead human was an older man with gray hair. He wore a formal suit and carried a large box. He smiled warmly as he approached. Ambassador Chen Wei had prepared carefully for this moment. He had practiced his greeting in 3 council languages. He had researched their customs. He had brought gifts that represented the best of humanity. He had no idea that he was already terrifying everyone in the room. Chen stepped forward and extended his hand toward Veshnarl. It was a traditional human greeting, showing that you held no weapon. But as he smiled, he showed his teeth. To many species in the council, baring teeth was a threat display. It was what predators did before they attacked. Veshnarl's crystalline structure made a small cracking sound. It was the Quilxari equivalent of a gasp of shock. But she forced herself to be calm. She was the High Counselor. She had to be diplomatic. She reached out and carefully touched the human's hand. It was warm, so warm, and when she touched his skin, she could feel his pulse. Fast, strong, the heartbeat of a predator. Chen spoke in perfect council standard. His translator was excellent. He said they were honored to be here. He said humanity looked forward to learning from the council. He said they came in peace, and then he mentioned casually that they had come as quickly as they could. They had just finished pacifying the belt pirates who had been raiding their outer colonies. Pacifying. The word hung in the air. The council did not pacify anyone. They negotiated. They mediated. They found peaceful solutions. Pacifying meant something else entirely. Colonel Sarah Okonkwo stood behind the ambassador, maintaining her ready stance. To her, this was completely normal. You always secured the area first. You always kept watch. It was basic security protocol. But the Venn delegate, a gentle telepathic being, was picking up her thoughts. Not the words, but the feelings. Alertness, readiness. The constant low-level preparation for violence that was so natural to humans, they did not even notice it anymore. To the Venn, it felt like standing next to a coiled spring, ready to explode into action at any moment. Ambassador Chen smiled again, still showing his teeth, still trying to be friendly. He gestured to the box he carried and said he had brought gifts, traditional items from Earth, he explained. Things that represented human culture and achievement. Veshnarl tried to feel hopeful. Perhaps the gifts would ease the tension. She had no idea what was in that box. But she was about to find out. Ambassador Chen Wei opened the gift box with pride. He had spent weeks selecting these items. Each one represented something important about humanity. Each one was meant to honor their new allies. He reached into the box and pulled out the first gift. It was a knife. The blade was about 8 inches long, made of folded steel that caught the light in beautiful patterns. The handle was wrapped in leather, worn smooth by years of use. It was a ceremonial weapon from the Marine Corps, one of Earth's most respected military organizations. Chen held it up carefully, showing its balance. He explained that this blade had been carried by a soldier through 3 campaigns. It was a symbol of honor, courage, and sacrifice. He was presenting it to the council as a mark of the deepest respect. On Earth, this would be an incredible honor. Warriors did not give away their blades lightly, but the council did not see it that way. They saw a weapon, a tool designed for killing, and the human was holding it up proudly, explaining that it had been used in battle, multiple battles. A Quilxari delegate in the back row made a sharp cracking sound. A stress fracture had appeared in their crystalline body. It was the equivalent of a human fainting. The Venn delegate broadcasted a wave of telepathic distress so strong that even the non-telepathic species felt uneasy. Their mind was screaming a single thought over and over. Weapon, weapon, weapon. Chen noticed the reaction but did not understand it. Perhaps they were simply overwhelmed by the honor. He had heard that some species were very emotional. He carefully placed the knife on the ceremonial table and reached for the second gift, hoping to salvage the moment. He pulled out a pair of boxing gloves. They were red leather, signed by the heavyweight champion of Earth. The signature was faded from age but still visible. Chen explained that boxing was one of humanity's oldest sports. It taught discipline, respect, and perseverance. These gloves had been worn by a champion who had won 32 fights. They represented the peak of human athletic achievement. To demonstrate, Chen put on one glove and threw a few practice punches in the air. Shadow boxing, it was called. The movements were smooth and controlled. Several delegates ducked. Others moved backward in their seats. The Threxian hive mind pulled 3 of its drone bodies completely out of the amphitheater. Because what Chen saw as a graceful demonstration of skill, they saw as a predator practicing attack movements. High Counselor Veshinaril felt her crystalline structure vibrating with stress. This was going badly, very badly, but she could not figure out how to stop it without causing a diplomatic incident. Chen removed the glove and placed the pair on the table next to the knife. He was starting to feel confused. The delegates looked frightened. Why would they be frightened? These were gifts of honor. Perhaps they needed context. Yes, that was it. They needed to understand human culture better. Chen smiled his warmest smile, showing all his teeth, and announced that he had brought educational materials. Historical documentaries that would help the Council understand humanity's journey to the stars. He gestured to one of his aides, who activated a holographic display. The amphitheater lights dimmed. The display flickered to life. The first scene showed a beach. Soldiers running through water, explosions everywhere, the sound of gunfire. The narrator's voice spoke about D-Day, the largest amphibious assault in human history. The images shifted. Ancient warriors in armor fighting with spears and swords. The Battle of Thermopylae. 300 warriors holding off an army. Then came samurai on horseback, their swords flashing in the sun. Medieval knights in full-plate armor. Modern soldiers with advanced weapons. Fighter jets screaming through the sky. Each scene showed conflict, battle, war. The narrator spoke with dramatic music in the background, talking about sacrifice and victory, honor and courage, the price of freedom and the cost of peace. The Threxian scholar, a mathematical hive mind, automatically calculated the casualty numbers being displayed. The numbers climbed higher and higher. Hundreds, thousands, millions. The hive mind withdrew completely from the amphitheater. It could not process the horror of what it was seeing. Chen watched the presentation with pride. These were some of humanity's finest moments, times when people came together to fight for what they believed in, times when ordinary people became heroes. When the presentation ended, he turned to the council with a reassuring smile. He said these were old conflicts. Ancient history. Humanity had gotten much better at warfare since then. Much better at warfare. The council did not find this reassuring. At all. Veshinaril announced a short break. Her voice was steady, but inside she was panicking. She needed time to think. They all needed time to think. The delegates filed out to the side chambers. The humans stayed in the main amphitheater looking confused. Chen turned to Colonel Okonkwo and asked quietly if he had made a mistake somehow. Okonkwo shook her head. Everything seemed proper to her. Maybe these species were just very formal. Some cultures were like that. She decided to make small talk with one of the remaining delegates, a Quilksari who had not fled with the others. Being friendly was important in diplomatic situations. She approached the crystalline being and started a casual conversation. She asked about their security protocols. Were they worried about threats to the station? How did they assess risks? The Quilksari stared at her, their internal structure flickering with stress patterns. Okonkwo, trying to be helpful, mentioned that Earth maintained a nuclear deterrent system. Just for peacekeeping, of course. Mutually assured destruction had kept the planet stable for decades before global unity. It was quite effective. The Quilksari made a sound like breaking glass and quickly moved away. Okonkwo frowned. She had definitely said something wrong. But what? Another human delegate, a military advisor named James, was talking with a group of younger council members. He was trying to lighten the mood by discussing hobbies. He mentioned that he enjoyed war games in his free time. Strategy simulations, very popular on Earth. The young delegate stared at him in horror. War games? As entertainment? James, not noticing their reaction, continued enthusiastically. His favorite was about ancient warfare. You commanded armies and conquered territories. Very educational, really. taught you about tactics and logistics. One of the young delegates excused themselves and left quickly. Another human, a scientist named Dr. Lisa Chen, mentioned that her daughter wanted to join the Space Marines when she grew up. The child thought the powered armor was cool. Dr. Chen was proud that her daughter wanted to serve Space Marines. The council members looked at each other nervously. Earth had Marines in space, armed forces specifically trained for combat in zero gravity. Every casual comment made things worse. Every friendly attempt at conversation revealed another aspect of humanity's military culture. In the medical bay, the station's chief medical officer was reviewing the biological data that the humans had provided as part of the standard diplomatic package. All species shared their basic biology so the station could provide appropriate life support. The medical officer read through the data and felt their organs clench with fear. Forward-facing eyes. That was the mark of a predator. Eyes on the front of the head for depth perception, for tracking prey. Omnivorous diet, but they regularly consumed meat. They hunted and ate other creatures. Exceptional endurance. Humans could run for hours without stopping. They were persistence predators. They chased their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. High levels of adrenaline and testosterone. Aggressive hormones that prepared the body for combat. Rapid healing. Dense bones. High pain tolerance. They were built to survive injuries that would kill most species. And their history. Oh, their history. The medical officer pulled up Earth's historical records. Conflict after conflict after conflict. They had been fighting for their entire recorded history. Wars between tribes. Wars between nations. Wars between continents. They had only achieved global unity 30 years ago, and even then it was because they needed to fight together against climate change. They had framed environmental recovery as a war against climate change. Everything was war to these beings. The medical officer sent the report to the High Counselor with a priority flag. This needed to be seen immediately. In the emergency council chamber, Veshinarl read the medical report. Her crystalline body dimmed as stress flooded through her. The humans were apex predators. Evolution had designed them for hunting, for fighting, for war. And they had never stopped. They had refined their violence over thousands of years, turning it into art, into sport, into entertainment. They had brought weapons to a peace meeting. They had shown footage of their massacres with pride. They spoke casually about nuclear deterrence and pacification and war games, and they seemed completely unaware that any of this was frightening. That was perhaps the most terrifying part. The humans thought this was normal. They thought this was friendly. Veshinarl looked around the emergency chamber at the other council members. She saw fear in every face, in every posture, in every nervous movement. They had to decide what to do about humanity, and they had to decide quickly before the humans noticed that something was very, very wrong. The emergency council session lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of debate, argument, and rising panic. Delegates from across the galaxy huddled in the secure chamber. Some paced nervously. Others sat in tight clusters, their voices low and urgent. The Ven telepaths had to leave the room entirely. The fear was so strong it was making them physically ill. High Counselor Veshinarl stood at the center of the chaos and tried to maintain order. It was not easy. A delegate from the conservative faction was speaking loudly. His species, the Marthics, were normally very calm, but today his scales were bright orange with stress. He said they needed to quarantine humanity immediately. Put them back on their planet and seal their space. Keep them contained until they evolved past their violent nature. It could take thousands of years, but it was the only safe option. A progressive delegate argued back. She was a Korath, a species that had once been warriors themselves. She said humanity deserved a chance. Yes, they were violent, but violence could be channeled into protection. The humans might become guardians rather than conquerors. The Marthix delegate flashed his scales in angry patterns. Protection? These beings brought weapons to a peace meeting. They showed massacre videos as entertainment. They trained their children for war. What kind of protection would that provide? A third voice joined in. This delegate was from the pragmatic faction, a species called the Zindari who specialized in practical solutions. She spoke quietly, but her words made everyone stop talking. She said if they rejected humanity, the humans might see it as an act of war. Silence fell over the chamber. Nobody had thought of that, but now that she said it, it seemed obvious. If they told humanity to leave, to go back to their space and stay there, how would the humans react? These were beings who named their ships things like Indomitable, who described negotiation as pacification, who taught their children that war was glorious. Would they accept rejection peacefully? Or would they see it as an insult, a challenge, a threat? The Council had not fought a war in 15,000 years. They had no weapons, no armies, no defense. If humanity decided to attack, what could they do? Veshnaril felt a wave of despair. How had this happened? They had welcomed thousands of species over the millennia. It was always a joyous occasion. But now they were trapped between two terrible choices: accept humanity and risk having violent predators in their peaceful society, or reject humanity and risk starting a war. The debate continued for another hour. Every option seemed impossible. Then the alarms went off. Red lights flashed throughout the station. An automated voice announced that an asteroid had been detected on a collision course. This happened occasionally in space. The station's shields would handle it easily. It was nothing to worry about, except the human ship responded first. The UNSS Indomitable's weapons fired before the Council could even finish processing what was happening. Point defense lasers tracked the asteroid with perfect precision. The rock exploded into fragments. The fragments exploded into smaller pieces. Within 3 seconds, nothing remained but harmless dust that scattered across space. It was the most efficient threat neutralization the Council had ever witnessed. It was also the first weapons discharge any of them had seen in their entire lives. A communication came through from Colonel Okonkwo. Her voice was professional and calm. She said the threat had been neutralized. No damage to the station. The humans were happy to help. She ended with a friendly phrase, "You're welcome." The emergency chamber erupted in panicked voices. The humans had weapons. Active weapons. Powerful weapons. And they had just demonstrated how quickly they could use them. The conservative faction demanded immediate quarantine. The progressive faction argued that the humans had just saved them from potential danger. The pragmatic faction pointed out that if the humans wanted to attack, they could have done so already. Veshnaril raised her crystalline arms for silence. The arguing stopped. She said they needed to be honest with humanity. They needed to explain that the Council found their culture concerning. It was the only way forward. But how could they do this safely? How could they tell apex predators that they were frightening without triggering an aggressive response? The delegates spent an hour crafting the perfect message. They practiced non-threatening language. They reviewed diplomatic protocols from 1,000 peaceful negotiations. They made sure every word was carefully chosen. They were terrified of getting it wrong. Finally, Veshnaril returned to the main amphitheater. The humans were waiting patiently. They had been talking among themselves, trying to figure out what was happening. Ambassador Chen looked worried. Colonel Okonkwo stood ready, her eyes constantly scanning the room. Veshnaril approached slowly. Her crystalline body flickered with nervous patterns. She spoke in the most gentle tone she could manage. She said the Council appreciated humanity's enthusiasm. But they had some concerns about humanity's martial traditions. Martial traditions. It was the most diplomatic phrase she could think of for constant warfare. Ambassador Chen looked confused for a moment. Then his face changed as understanding slowly dawned. He stood very still, processing this new information. He asked permission to review the Council's historical records. Veshnaril agreed immediately. She was relieved that he was not angry. Chen sat down with a data tablet and began reading. Colonel Okonkwo stood behind him, also reading over his shoulder. The other human delegates gathered around. They read about the Council's history. 15,000 years of peace. No wars, no weapons, no violence. Conflicts resolved through discussion and compromise. Security forces that had never raised a hand in anger. They read about the Council species, herbivores and filter feeders, prey animals and cooperative colonies, species whose evolution had favored cooperation over competition, sharing over conflict. Chen put down the tablet and rubbed his eyes. He looked tired suddenly, very tired. He turned to Veshnaril and spoke quietly. He said he understood now. The Council had no military because they did not need one. They had never needed one. They lived in a peaceful part of space where violence was not necessary, but humanity came from a different kind of place. Earth had large predators. Weather that could kill, diseases that swept through populations, scarce resources that people had to fight over. And when humans finally reached space, they found it was no safer. Pirates raided colonies. Asteroids threatened settlements. Alien microbes killed unprepared explorers. Humanity had not developed weapons because they were evil. They developed weapons because their environment demanded it. They kept their military because the universe kept proving that they needed it. Chen said the gifts were meant to honor the council. The knife represented courage. The boxing gloves represented discipline. The historical videos showed humanity at their best, fighting for survival and freedom. But he understood now why those gifts seemed threatening. Because the council had never needed courage in battle. They had never had to fight for survival. They had never known what it meant to be constantly vigilant. Veshnarl listened carefully. Her fear was slowly being replaced by something else. Understanding, perhaps, or maybe sadness. She said the council was naive. They had been protected by their location, by their good fortune. They had 15,000 years of peace not because they were wise, but because they were lucky. And humanity had been unlucky. They had faced constant threats and responded by becoming stronger, faster, more dangerous. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Ambassador Chen nodded slowly. Then he smiled, but this time he kept his mouth closed, aware now of how his teeth might look to herbivorous species. He said he had a proposal. Perhaps humanity and the council could help each other. The council had knowledge, culture, and technology. Thousands of years of peaceful development had created wonders that humanity could barely imagine. But humanity had something the council did not have. Experience with danger, the ability to protect, the willingness to stand guard while others slept safely. What if humanity joined the council not as equals but as protectors? They would maintain their military capabilities, but use them to defend council space from external threats. In return, the council would help humanity grow culturally and technologically. Colonel Okonkwo stepped forward and added her support. She said humanity could establish a galactic security academy. They would train volunteers from council species. Not to make them into warriors, but to teach them basic protection, threat assessment, and emergency response, because the universe was not always safe. And it was better to be prepared. Veshnarl felt hope rising in her crystalline core. This might work. This might actually work. She said she would present the proposal to the full council. It would require a vote. But she thought there was a chance. After all, better to have humanity as allies than as strangers in the dark. The vote took place 2 days later. Those 2 days felt like an eternity to everyone involved. The humans stayed aboard the Indomitable during the deliberations. Ambassador Chen had offered to give the council space to think. It was the diplomatic thing to do. But privately, he worried that they had made a terrible mistake. That humanity would be rejected and sent back to their corner of space alone again. Colonel Okonkwo tried to keep the crew busy. They ran drills and maintenance checks, but everyone knew what was really happening. They were waiting to see if the galaxy wanted them or feared them. On the station, the debate raged through every chamber and corridor. Delegates argued in the formal council halls and in the quiet cafeterias. They discussed philosophy and practicality, idealism and reality. The conservative faction remained opposed. They argued that accepting humanity would change the council forever. Violence would become normalized. The peaceful culture they had built over 15,000 years would be corrupted. The progressive faction argued that change was not always bad. The council had grown comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. The universe was larger and more dangerous than they wanted to believe. Having allies who understood danger might save them someday. The pragmatic faction did what they always did. They ran calculations. They analyzed data. They looked at the probable outcomes of each choice. If they rejected humanity, the humans might leave peacefully. Or they might not. Even a small chance of conflict was unacceptable when the council had no way to defend itself. If they accepted humanity as protectors, the humans might abuse that power. Or they might not. The psychological profile suggested that humans had strong protective instincts, especially toward those they considered part of their group. The pragmatic faction concluded that acceptance was the safer choice. Better to have humanity inside the council, where they could be influenced and guided, than outside as an unknown factor. High Counselor Veshnarl spent those 2 days in private meditation. She thought about her long life, about the thousands of years of peace she had witnessed. She thought about the price of that peace. The council had been lucky, but luck always ran out eventually. She thought about the humans, about Ambassador Chen's tired eyes when he realized how sheltered the council had been, about Colonel Okonkwo's constant vigilance, about the crew who destroyed that asteroid without hesitation, protecting strangers they had just met. Perhaps humanity was exactly what the council needed. On the morning of the vote, Veshnarl stood before the full assembly. Every delegate was present. Even the species that normally participated remotely had sent physical representatives. This was too important to miss. She gave a speech. She talked about fear and courage, about the difference between violence and protection, about the need to grow and adapt, even when growth was uncomfortable. She said that humanity frightened them because humanity reminded them of something they had forgotten. The universe was not always kind. Peace was not the natural state of things. Peace had to be maintained, protected, defended. The council had 15,000 years of peace because they were lucky enough to live in a safe region of space. But there were other regions, dangerous regions. And if they wanted to grow, to explore, to connect with more species, they would need to venture into those dangerous places. They could not do that alone. When she finished, the chamber was silent for a long moment. Then the voting began. The vote was close, very close, but in the end, acceptance won by a margin of 62%. Humanity would join the Galactic Council as a protectorate species. They would maintain their military capabilities and use them to defend Council space. In return, they would receive full access to Council knowledge, technology, and trade networks. Veshnarl sent the message to the Indomitable personally. Ambassador Chen received the message in his quarters. He read it 3 times to make sure he understood. Then he sat down heavily and put his face in his hands. Colonel Okonkwo found him like that 10 minutes later. She asked if the news was bad. Chen looked up. His eyes were wet. He said the news was good. Humanity had a place in the galaxy, not as conquerors or as outcasts, but as guardians, as protectors. It was more than he had hoped for. The formal acceptance ceremony took place the next day. This time the humans knew better. They came wearing civilian clothes. They left their weapons on the ship. They smiled with their mouths closed, but some things could not be changed. Their eyes still scanned for threats. Their posture still showed readiness. They were what they were, shaped by their dangerous universe, and the council was learning to accept that. Veshnarl performed the traditional welcome ceremony. She spoke the ancient words that had welcomed 312 species before humanity, words about peace and unity, about cooperation and mutual respect. Then she added new words, created specifically for humanity. She said that humanity would stand watch while others dreamed. They would face dangers so others could remain safe. They would carry the burden of vigilance so others could enjoy peace. It was a heavy responsibility. But humanity had been carrying heavy responsibilities for their entire existence. Ambassador Chen accepted on behalf of his species. He promised that humanity would protect the council with the same fierce determination they had always used to protect their own. The ceremony ended with a shared meal. This time, the humans had researched appropriate foods for each species. No one brought weapons as gifts. Instead, they brought art and music, poetry, and mathematical proofs. It was a much better reception. But as the delegates mingled and talked, something interesting happened. A young Quilxari approached Colonel Okonkwo nervously. The crystalline being was a junior security officer, one of the 3 who had been so useless during the first meeting. The Quilxari asked Okonkwo about the security academy. Was the offer serious? Could they really learn human methods? Okonkwo smiled, remembering to keep her teeth hidden. She said the offer was absolutely serious. They would start with basics: threat assessment, emergency response, nonviolent de-escalation, crisis management. The Quilxari asked if they would learn to fight. Okonkwo considered the question carefully. She said they would learn to defend themselves and others. Fighting was only one small part of security. The real skill was in prevention, in recognizing danger before it arrived, in keeping people safe without ever needing violence. But yes, if necessary, they would learn to fight. Because sometimes fighting was the only option left. The Quilxari's internal structure glowed with determination. They said they wanted to learn. Their species had been security officers for 5,000 years, but they had never actually provided security. They wanted to change that. By the end of the evening, Okonkwo had 17 volunteers from 9 different species. All of them wanted to join the first class at the Security Academy. It was a beginning. As the celebration wound down, Ambassador Chen stood with High Counselor Veshnaril, looking out at the crowd. Humans and aliens mingling together, still cautious, still uncertain, but trying. Veshnaril asked Chen if he thought this would work. If humanity could truly integrate with the Council's peaceful culture. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he said he did not know. Humanity would probably always be a little frightening to species who had never needed to fight. But fear was not always bad. A little healthy fear kept everyone alert, and alertness kept everyone safe. Veshnaril flickered with thoughtful patterns. She said that was a very human perspective. But perhaps the Council needed some human perspective. They had been comfortable for too long. Comfortable species did not grow. They stagnated. Maybe humanity was exactly the challenge the Council needed. Chen smiled at that. He said humanity had plenty of challenges to share, and for the first time since arriving at Harmony Station, he did not feel like an outsider. He felt like someone who belonged, even if he did still frighten half the delegates. 6 months passed. 6 months that changed everything. The Galactic Security Academy opened on a small moon orbiting Harmony Station. Colonel Okonkwo served as commandant. She had 17 students in her first class, representing 9 species. They were terrible at everything. The Quilsari could not run without cracking their crystalline legs. The Ven telepaths became overwhelmed by aggressive thoughts during combat training. The Threxian hive mind could not coordinate its drones when stressed. The Marthics kept fainting whenever they tried to strike a target, but they were trying. That was what mattered. Okonkwo adapted her training methods. Instead of turning peaceful species into soldiers, she taught them situational awareness. How to spot danger, how to evacuate civilians, how to call for help effectively, how to stay calm in emergencies. The students slowly improved. The young Quilsari who had first volunteered learned to recognize suspicious behavior in station crowds. A Ven student mastered the art of broadcasting calm during panic situations. A Threxian drone cluster became excellent at coordinating evacuations. They would never be warriors, but they were becoming protectors, and that was enough. Meanwhile, the cultural exchange program was having unexpected effects. Human scientists collaborated with Council researchers, combining practical engineering with theoretical brilliance. The results were extraordinary. New propulsion systems, better medical technology, more efficient energy production. But the humans were learning too. They attended Council philosophy lectures. They studied alien art forms. They learned meditation techniques from species who had perfected mental peace over thousands of years. Slowly, carefully, the two cultures began to blend. The Council learned that strength could be used for protection. Humanity learned that not every problem required a military solution. Human ships began patrolling Council space. At first, the sight of armed vessels made many species nervous, but as time passed, they became reassuring instead. The humans were watching. The humans would respond if anything went wrong. Nothing did go wrong. For 6 months, everything was peaceful. Then the raiders came. They emerged from the galactic frontier, a region beyond Council space where civilization had not yet reached. 23 ships heavily armed, moving fast. They were a species called the Kresh, reptilian beings who survived by raiding and stealing. They had heard about the wealthy Council worlds and decided to take what they wanted. The Kresh had no idea that the Council had defenders now. The warning came at 0400 station time. Sensors detected the incoming fleet at the edge of Council space. They were heading toward a colony world called Veshkar, home to 2 billion Quilsari. High Counselor Veshnaril was woken by emergency alarms. She arrived at the command center to find chaos. Council officials were panicking. They had no idea what to do. Violence was theoretical to them. This was real. Then a human voice cut through the panic. Calm, professional, certain. Colonel Okonkwo was already mobilizing the human defense fleet. 7 ships, including the Indomitable. It was not a large force, but it was a professional one. Okonkwo requested permission to engage. Her voice showed no fear, no hesitation. This was what humans did. This was what they had always done. Veshinarl gave permission immediately. The human fleet moved to intercept. They positioned themselves between the raiders and the colony world. When the Kresh saw them, they must have laughed. 7 small ships against 23? It would be easy. But the Kresh had never fought humans before. The battle lasted 17 minutes. The humans moved with perfect coordination. Their weapons fire was precise. Their tactics were brutal and efficient. They disabled the Kresh ships one by one, targeting engines and weapon systems, leaving the hulls intact so the crews would survive but could not fight. The Kresh tried to fight back, but their weapons were designed for raiding defenseless targets. The human ships had real military shields, real point defense, real combat experience. When it was over, 19 Kresh ships were disabled. 4 had fled back into the frontier. Not a single human ship was seriously damaged, and most importantly, not one civilian on Veshkar had been harmed. The Council watched it all happen on long-range sensors. They saw humanity's capacity for violence, but they also saw something else. The humans did not destroy the Kresh ships completely. They disabled them and then immediately offered medical assistance. They treated wounded raiders with the same care they would treat their own. The Ven telepaths monitoring the battle reported something incredible. During the fight, the human thoughts were not filled with bloodlust or hatred. They were filled with determination and protective instinct. The humans were not enjoying the violence. They were simply doing what needed to be done. After the battle, Colonel Okonkwo made contact with the disabled Kresh ships. She told them that this space was protected. If they returned for peaceful trade, they would be welcome. If they returned to raid, they would be stopped again. It was their choice. The Kresh commander, wounded but alive, asked who these terrifying defenders were. Okonkwo said they were humanity. And humanity protected its friends. When the human fleet returned to Harmony Station, something unexpected happened. The docking bays were crowded with council species. Thousands of them. They had come to see the ships, to meet the crews. There was no fear in their eyes anymore. There was gratitude and respect. The young Quilksari from the Security Academy was there, their crystalline body glowing bright with emotion. They approached Colonel Okonkwo and said something simple. "Thank you." Okonkwo nodded. She understood what those words meant. The council finally understood what humanity was. Not conquerors. Not monsters, guardians. High Counselor Veshinarl held an emergency session, but this time it was not about fear. It was about gratitude. She gave a speech that would be remembered for generations. She said the council had been afraid of humanity because they did not understand them. Humans were warriors, yes, but they were warriors who fought so others did not have to. They carried the burden of violence so others could remain innocent of it. The council had 15,000 years of peace not because violence was impossible, but because they were lucky enough to avoid it. Now they had allies who would ensure that their luck continued. The Assembly voted unanimously to grant humanity full membership status. Not as protectors, as equals. Partners. Applications to the Security Academy increased tenfold overnight. Young beings from across council space wanted to learn from humans. Not to become warriors themselves, but to understand protection, readiness, and courage. The first joint Human Council research station opened 3 weeks later. It combined the best of both cultures, human practicality and council brilliance. Together, they began solving problems that neither could solve alone. New trade routes opened into previously dangerous regions. Human escorts made them safe. Council merchants followed, bringing prosperity to frontier worlds. The Kresh, surprisingly, returned 6 weeks after the battle. But they came in peace. They wanted to trade, to learn, to join the council themselves. The universe was changing, their commander said. They could change with it or be left behind. 3 months after that, Ambassador Chen stood with High Counselor Veshinaril, watching council and human ships patrol together. Mixed crews, mixed cultures, working together perfectly. Veshinaril asked if Chen ever thought about that first meeting. The gifts that went so wrong. The fear and misunderstanding. Chen smiled. He said he thought about it often. It reminded him that good intentions were not enough. Understanding was necessary. Communication was vital. And sometimes the things that frightened people were exactly what they needed. Veshinaril flickered with amusement. She asked if humanity would ever stop being a little frightening. Chen laughed. Probably not, he said, but that was okay. A little healthy fear kept everyone honest, and more importantly, it kept everyone safe. In the distance, a class of Security Academy students was practicing emergency response drills. They were still terrible at most of it, but they were learning. They were trying. Colonel Okonkwo watched them with pride. These beings would never be soldiers, but they did not need to be soldiers. They needed to be aware, prepared, ready to protect their people in small ways. Let humanity handle the big threats. These students would handle the everyday ones. That was the new way forward. Humanity providing the shield. The Council providing the culture, knowledge, and wisdom behind that shield. Together they were stronger than either could be alone. Ambassador Chen received a message from Earth that evening. The United Nations wanted to send more ships, more personnel, more resources. Humanity was needed. Humanity was valued. Humanity belonged. Chen approved the request. Then he walked to the observation deck and looked out at the stars. So many stars, so many worlds, so much possibility. Humanity had spent so long alone, fighting its own battles, surviving its own dangers. But now they had allies, friends, a family that stretched across the galaxy. Yes, they still frightened some species. Yes, they were still the warriors in a peaceful society. Yes, they carried weapons while others carried flowers. But they were accepted. They were wanted. They had a purpose. To stand watch while others dreamed of peace. To face danger so others could remain safe. To be the guardians of a civilization that believed in something better.